The game is finally upon us. It is the 2023 rendition of Michigan versus Ohio State. The stakes of this game are at an all-time high. Two top three teams vying for the right to compete in the playoffs as well as the Big Ten championship game and perhaps win a national championship. Today we're going to go position by position, break down the rosters and the matchups, and figure out who is going to win this game. But before all of that, I'm going to go ahead and ask you to like, comment, and subscribe. It really helps me out if you were to do so. The goal is 500 subscribers before the end of the year. So go ahead and hit that subscribe button. And now with the intro out of the way, I'd like to say hello and welcome to the JSA studio. I'm your host, as always, Nathan. And today we're going to be breaking down the game, starting with the quarterback position. That, of course, mainly being the two starting quarterbacks, J.J. McCarthy and Kyle McCord. Let's go ahead and start with Kyle McCord, who might be, in my opinion, the most disrespected player in all of college football. Because I'm not sure there's a quarterback where there is such a large disconnect between reality and the narrative. Now, there is also one with J.J. McCarthy, but we'll talk about that when we have the time. It's not nearly as big as a disconnect between Kyle McCord and the perception of what Kyle McCord is. Kyle McCord is, inarguably, in my opinion, the second best quarterback in the Big Ten. Now, that's not an extraordinarily high standard or anything. It's not like this is the Pac-12, but the gap between Kyle McCord and number 3 is about 4 times as large as the gap between Kyle McCord and whoever I have at number 1. Now, if you've been around this channel before, you know that I am a fan of Pro Football Focus and their grading system. However, Pro Football Focus, PFF, is not the Lord's word, okay? They are sometimes wrong about things, objectively speaking. And their grades of Kyle McCord and the breakdowns as to what areas he struggles in are laughable. Even by their own data, it doesn't support the conclusions that they're coming to. And what do I mean by this? What I mean by this is that Kyle McCord is, according to PFF, the worst starting quarterback in the Big Ten when under pressure. However, even by their own metrics, he's the third best quarterback in the Big Ten when blitzed. So I don't particularly know how they could come to the conclusion that when blitzed, he has a 69 overall grade. When not blitzed, he has an 81.5 overall grade. And when under pressure, he has a 28 overall grade. For what it's worth, people, PFF also had C.J. Stroud when under pressure as being very bad, not as bad. I think he was in like the 40s in terms of his grade, which was an absurd statement as well. It was an extraordinarily small sample size, which is the same thing we're dealing with. Kyle McCord here is an extraordinarily small sample size, and he has made plays when pressured. He showed it in the Georgia game this past season. I'm talking about C.J. Stroud right now. And for Kyle McCord, he's shown flashes of being able to deal with pressure appropriately. He's just never been under pressure consistently enough to be able to make plays. We're talking about just about 25% of his dropbacks and 84 total snaps or total dropbacks, I should say, not snaps necessarily, but total dropbacks where he has been under pressure. That's very, very small. To put that into perspective, J.J. McCarthy has been under pressure on about 30% of his snaps, but only 79 dropbacks, and Caleb Williams has been under pressure on about 33% of his dropbacks, but that's 152 dropbacks. And Drake May has been under pressure on 29% of his attempts and had 134 dropbacks. So 84 dropbacks is a very small number, as is 79 as well. So I don't particularly think that we can really draw a conclusion that Kyle McCord is bad under pressure from such a small sample size, okay? And that's a big narrative that a lot of people are talking about, is about how Kyle McCord is bad under pressure and about how Michigan has been getting pressure fairly consistently all year. So while that is a point that we will talk about more in the offensive line section of this video, the main point of me talking about all of this is that I don't think Kyle McCord is this player who's just going to completely fall apart if he gets hit a couple of times. Shifting focus here, we're going to talk about J.J. McCarthy now, because J.J. McCarthy is the number one quarterback in the Big Ten, by me, alluding to when I said whoever I have at number one. I do think J.J. McCarthy is better than Kyle McCord, so there's that. But I do think he's probably quite a bit overrated. I don't think he's a top 10 quarterback in the country. I think he's probably somewhere between 15 and 20. Now, that being said, I still also believe that he is a first-round talent. Not necessarily that if he were to declare this year that he would go in the first round, but I do think he is a first-round talent at the quarterback position, which is not something that I can say about Kyle McCord, given his level of play that I've seen this year, which has been good, but he's not a top 20 quarterback in the country this year. Getting on topic here a little bit, I've gone on a tangent several times. J.J. McCarthy, I think, is a little bit overrated, particularly when it comes to how he deals with pressure. And this is another flaw, in my opinion, in the grading system for PFF. Basically, when J.J. McCarthy has been in trouble, it's been him running around and getting out of it, and then somebody comes open late, or he's directing his receivers to go places, and then he's making a play downfield, okay? That is not the same as standing in the pocket and delivering a pass when under pressure. That's being creative outside of the structure of the play. That's not playing under pressure by my definition of what playing under pressure is. So when PFF says that J.J. McCarthy is the number one quarterback in the Big Ten when under pressure, they're not really talking about him just standing in the pocket and delivering a ball as he's getting hit, because that is not something that he's actually good at. What he's good at is running around until somebody gets open. And I do not believe he will have the opportunity to do that against Ohio State. Ohio State has the level of athlete along the defensive line and the discipline in order to keep their rush lanes so that J.J. McCarthy doesn't have anywhere to escape to. And that's something that they've done the entire year, because Ohio State's defensive line is extraordinarily well coached, just like it always is. However, the counter argument to that from the pro J.J. McCarthy side of this is that J.J. McCarthy is not under pressure a whole lot to begin with, and he still probably will be able to extend some plays even if they keep good rush lanes, because he is just such a tremendously good athlete. Also, the ball comes out of J.J. McCarthy's hands really fast most of the time. They don't do a whole lot of long developing pass plays. It's really just one read, get the ball out kind of an offense with J.J. McCarthy right now. And given that this is Ohio State, he'll probably just look to run if the first read isn't there. And his legs is really the separator here, because I actually think they're fairly similar in terms of passing prowess. I would say Kyle McCord is just slightly better in terms of being an actual passer of the football, not in terms of talent. Again, I want to reiterate that because some people are going to get mad at me and bring up the fact that J.J. McCarthy is getting mocked in the top 10 of the draft and Kyle McCord is a late day 3 pick right now. Talent does not necessarily equate to level of play on the football field at the college football level. And right now, Kyle McCord in college football is a better passer of the football. But there is no comparison between the two when it comes to running the football and being a threat as a runner, somebody that the defense has to take account of. So they're practically even passing, and JJ is just a different level of athlete when it comes to running the football. So overall, as a football player, J.J. McCarthy is the better player, so I'm going to give Michigan the edge at the quarterback position. So unlike the past 2 years, both of these teams are basically 100% healthy, and that can be illustrated here by the running back room the most clearly. Travion Henderson barely played in 2022, and like Corum also played, I think, like 3 snaps. He was playing on a torn meniscus because it's Ohio State. So he was like, I'm going to die if I need to, but I'm going to play this game. But now, pretty much for the most part, with the exception of Mayan Williams, what doesn't particularly matter because Chip Trainum is just better Mayan Williams, both of these running back rooms are 100% healthy. And that's good because both of these running back rooms are the engine that makes the offense run. Let's start with Michigan this time. So Blake Corum is the number 1 running back, and he's the person who I think is going to end up getting somewhere between 25 and 30 carries in this game. And I think we'll see maybe 10 to 15 touches of Donovan Edwards and maybe 1 or 2 snaps of Khalil Mullings. But Blake Corum is going to be the guy for about 90% of this game. And what Blake Corum has done this year has been a guy that gets you somewhere between 3 and 7 yards each time he touches the football. Michigan in general, but also just Blake Corum, hasn't really had any explosive plays this year with the exception of Penn State. And that is somewhat concerning because the Michigan passing game also doesn't really generate any explosive plays. Now, that being said, Blake Corum also hasn't particularly tried in terms of like level of effort in any game aside from Penn State. And I think you can basically say that about every single player except J.J. McCarthy on the Michigan team. And when you want to talk about Donovan Edwards, he's just been flat out and straight up not effective outside of Penn State this year. In fact, it's kind of been really bad. He's looked not healthy. I don't know if there was some injury that we don't know about because Donovan Edwards and the University of Michigan does not have to disclose injuries because they're a college team, not a professional team. But I'm guessing that there was because he did not look explosive at all outside of the Penn State game. He looked noticeably like a step or 2 slower the entire year, except again for Penn State. And he doesn't really have that same elusiveness and that same break tackles that he had last year. Even when he was splitting carries with Blake Corum, he was still a tremendously effective running back last year, and he still broke off a lot of big plays, which is not something we've seen out of him pretty much at all this year. He had the 1 run against Penn State. I actually believe that Khalil Mullings has been your second best running back for the most part this year. And he's only ever really gotten carries during garbage time because, you know, it is what it is. But I actually really like Khalil Mullings all of a sudden. He was not someone who coming into this year I was very high on. Like, I did not believe he was going to be running back 3. I didn't know who the hell it was going to be, but I thought for sure it wasn't going to be Khalil Mullings. No, it is Khalil Mullings, and I have zero hesitations about him being the main back next year should Blake Corum, who's already said he's going to declare, and Donovan Edwards both declare for the NFL draft. And it looks like Benjamin Hall is somebody that also potentially has a lot of upside to be a running back as well. And we can go further down into guys like Cabana or whatever his name is, as someone who I really like in terms of upside because he's got a lot of speed. But those guys don't particularly play a factor in this game. For Ohio State, we're really looking at 2 running backs here as well, and that's Travion Henderson and Chip Trainum. Mayan Williams is hurt. He did come in and play when he was healthy, even when all 3 of them were healthy at the same time. He did come in and have sort of a role, but he's not going to play this week as far as I'm aware. And Travion Henderson and Chip Trainum are both healthy. Now, Travion Henderson, had he not missed those 3 games, I think would be in the conversation for the Heisman Trophy right now because he's been phenomenal. I was a very vocal critic of Travion Henderson the past 2 years, mainly because he wasn't actually a very good running back these past 2 years. But this year, the game seems to have finally slowed down for him. You're seeing elite levels of vision, elite levels of elusiveness and make you miss, and also legit 4.3 speed from the running back position, which is a very rare thing. Where he does struggle is consistency. He'll kind of, do that kind of sort of Barry Sanders thing where he'll make somebody miss and then run directly into somebody else for a 2-yard gain. And it is frustrating to watch sometimes, but I think a lot of that is a symptom of the run blocking rather than him as a running back. Because when the run blocking is there, he takes it to the house like every single time. It's just that the run blocking is almost never there. In fact, I kind of think Michigan and Ohio State, in terms of the run game, have flipped from last year. Last year, when they had Mayan Williams running the ball consistently, he was getting 4, 5, 6 yards every single time he touched the football. And Michigan was a little bit more inconsistent, but they were getting these big, long, explosive runs. That's the exact opposite of this year. Blake Corum is the guy that gets 4, 5, 6 yards every time he touches the football, and Travion Henderson is the guy that takes it to the house every time he touches the ball. Now, really quickly about Chip Trayanum before I get to the decision in terms of who I think is better. Chip Trayanum is a very, very good athlete for his size, which is like 6'2" and 230. And also an extraordinary short yardage and power back. I really, really like Chip Trayanum. And should he be the back next year, I think you're in good hands. Basically, this conversation boils down to who's better this year, Blake Corum or Travion Henderson, because Chip Trayanum has obviously been better so far this year than Donovan Edwards. Donovan Edwards had 1 game of okay play and 9 of being extraordinarily ineffective. It's also worth noting Chip Trayanum, when he was the lead back, wasn't the most effective running back in all of college football either, okay? He's much better as a change of pace guy right now. But I would give Ohio State the edge at the RB2 spot, based off of what I've seen so far this year out of Donovan Edwards and Chip Trayanum. And at the RB1 spot, I'm also going to give it to Ohio State. I think this year Travion Henderson has been better than Blake Corum because Travion Henderson has shown the ability to be fairly consistent when running the football. Again, there is some inconsistencies there, but he's also got those big explosive runs and the potential to be able to do that anytime he touches the football. Blake Corum does not have that this year. He did last year, doesn't so much this year. So as a group, I am giving Ohio State the edge at the running back position. So we spent 16 minutes talking about quarterbacks and running backs. Well, these next 2 positions, we're not going to spend nearly as long talking about them. When it comes to the skill positions, which for the purpose of this video is just wide receivers and tight ends, it's pretty clear that Ohio State has the better group here. Marvin Harrison is the best wide receiver I've ever seen at the college level. Emeka Egbuka is a borderline first-round prospect. Fleming is a draftable wide receiver, probably early day 3 in my opinion. And Cade Stober, I think, probably ends up being a day 2 pick in this upcoming draft. Michigan has Roman Wilson, Colston Loveland, and A.J. Barner. That group is not comparable to Ohio State's group. You can make an argument, if I was breaking this down into wide receivers and tight ends, that Michigan would have a better tight end group, but that's still a conversation that you have to have, and there is no conversation surrounding the wide receiver groups between these 2 teams. So I'm going to give the skill position edge to the Ohio State Buckeyes. Now, what kind of impact does that have on this game here? Well, Ohio State still has the advantage in the passing game because of their wide receivers, and specifically Marvin Harrison. They're going to be able to pass the ball, provided the offensive line doesn't just completely fall apart, which I think is very unlikely. And more so than that, I don't think Michigan will have the advantage against Ohio State's secondary, but I think Ohio State will have the advantage against Michigan's secondary. Okay, so the offensive line. This conversation really kind of can break down into 2 ways if you want to look at it. Run game versus pass game, and interior versus exterior. When it comes to depth, Michigan obviously has the advantage, but that doesn't particularly matter as much along the offensive line as it does with other positions, because generally speaking, you're not rotating into your depth along the offensive line. So let's break this down, interior versus exterior. Exterior being the tackle position. And when you're talking about the tackles, you have to talk about pass game versus run game, okay? Because Michigan's right tackle, namely Carson Barnhart, has been very bad in pass protection the past 3 weeks. Mainly because Michigan has finally played somebody with a pulse in the pass rush. Now, I will also say Chop Robinson is a first-round pick and maybe a top 20 talent in the entire draft. So him going up against a guy who's borderline draftable, you would expect him to dominate that matchup. Now, the left tackle position has been a different story for Michigan because since they moved Carson Barnhart to right tackle when they should have moved him to the bench, but that's just me. But Ladarius Henderson came in and played left tackle, and he's been really, really good. Borderline dominant in the run game and effective passing. Hasn't really gotten beat really bad at any point this year. Now, Michigan also didn't particularly give him the opportunity to get beat against Penn State, but that is what it is. Those are the two guys that I expect to be starting. I don't know if they'll finish the position because I don't know if they'll finish the game because I have a sneaking suspicion that Carson Barnhart is going to get his ass destroyed. So they might bring in Trente Jones or Miles Hinton to come in and play right tackle after a while. But I think that's fairly unlikely. I think they'll probably just help him in the passing game. And speaking of helping in the passing game, that's what Ohio State does with both of their tackles. Now, Josh Fryer, generally speaking, has been able to stand on his own, but there are times, specifically Wisconsin, but also against Rutgers as well, where he's looked kind of bad. Now, he doesn't have the penalty problems that Josh Simmons has, but Fryer is not a great offensive lineman by any means. I would quantify him as good. Like, I think he's solid. Like, he's not somebody you particularly have to worry about at the right tackle position, but him being your best offensive lineman, which in my opinion he is, that's not a great look. Now, if we were going by PFF sort of things, which you have to keep in mind, Pro Football Focus is an interesting and useful tool, but it's not the end-all be-all. Specifically when it comes to offensive linemen, they're kind of really bad at figuring out the college level and who's playing well and who isn't. At least in my opinion, they are. I think they kind of struggle with that at the college level. And I think it also might have something to do with the fact that they have like 20 times as many players to watch at the college level than in the NFL, so they can't particularly take the time to look at all of them as in-depth as they do in the NFL. But I'm going on a tangent here. Let's get back to focus. When we're talking about Ohio State's offensive line, the right tackle position, Josh Fryer, has kind of been left on his own, and he has gotten beat at times this year. He played, honestly, really bad against Wisconsin, played kind of just normally bad against Rutgers, but outside of that, he's been pretty solid. He has given up, I think, 7 sacks this year, or at least Pro Football Focus has credited him with giving up 7 sacks. And Josh Simmons at the left tackle position, according to Pro Football Focus, has not given up a sack. However, lost in that statistic is the fact that on almost every single pass rush set, Josh Simmons is getting help from somebody, whether that's the left guard or a running back or a tight end. He's getting a lot of help. Also, Josh Simmons does have, I think, 9 penalties, I believe is the number, and that's very high for the position. So even though I do think it's more of a conversation than I think maybe some people on the Michigan side want to admit, when it comes to the tackle position, I would give the advantage to Michigan, at least in pass blocking. Now, as far as run blocking is concerned, this one is a little bit more clear, and this is definitely in favor of Michigan. Ohio State has struggled for stretches of pretty much every single game to run block. And just there's an overall level of inconsistency with the run blocking this year that has not been there in previous years under Ohio State. And I don't think it's a scheme problem. I think it's a talent problem and an execution problem and a fact that this legitimately might just be your least talented offensive line that you've had in like a decade, maybe longer. So let's go ahead and move in now to the interior of the offensive line. And I do think there is a pretty clear best player here, and that's Zach Zinter from Michigan. I think there's a real possibility Zach Zinter is the first guard taken in this upcoming class because of the athletic upside of him. Connor Beebe out of Kansas State is probably the best overall prospect in terms of being a player, but because Zach Zinter, I think, is a better athlete than him, some teams, specifically if they run a lot of zone, might want Zach Zinter over him. And while I do think Donovan Jackson is a draftable player if he were to leave this year, I do believe that he has a COVID year of eligibility, so he could return. But if he does leave, I think he's, a borderline day 2 pick, if not probably early day 3. I do think that he has plug and play starter potential, but he also might struggle at the next level a little bit. He's been maybe the most disappointing player for Ohio State the entire year, Donovan Jackson has. He's someone who came into this year as my guard 1 and like a top 40-ish pick, so like back end of the first round, if not early second. And he's been very disappointing to me right now. So I haven't gone back and regraded a lot of these players and watched the film in depth. That's for next month. But nevertheless, I do find him to have been a disappointment this year. However, I do think there's a conversation for him to still be the second best player along the interior here. I wouldn't say that. I think Drake Nugent, the center for Michigan, is probably the second best player. I also think he's a day 2 pick in this upcoming draft class. He's been lights out for Michigan so far this year in the run game and in the pass game. And I think you can make the argument he's been Michigan's best offensive player this year outside of Blake Corum. So the interior, specifically if we're going position by position and comparing like left guard to left guard, center to center, and right guard to right guard, Michigan has the advantage on like all of them except for maybe left guard. But as a group along the interior, I think it's pretty clear that Michigan has the better group of 3 players. And I already said that Michigan has the slightly better group of tackles, so you can put 2 and 2 together here. And I'm going to finish off this section by stating what maybe I think a lot of people believe, and that's that I do think Michigan does have the slightly better offensive line group. Moving on to the defensive line. This is the one where I think most people, or at least the one where the most people, are going to have a problem with my conclusion here. Michigan has about 9 defensive linemen that play around 20 to 30 snaps a game. Ohio State doesn't have a rotation like that. They pretty much have 5 guys, and that's really only because they bring in Michael Hall during pass rush situations along the interior. But JT Tuimoloau and Jack Sawyer have both played 90+% of the pass rushing snaps at that position this year. So they're really, I don't know if it's a depth problem. I don't know, I'm being honest with you. I don't know if it's a depth problem, if it's a youth problem along the defensive line, but they do not rotate like Michigan does along the defensive line. If we were just talking about taking the best 4 players and putting them out on the field, I think Ohio State would win. But that's not how the defensive line works. Michigan has 9 players that they can play with basically no drop-off in production. And the defensive line is the one unit where depth matters the most. Also, there's a very strong argument to be made that even if we were doing the 4 best players out on the field and who's better, that Michigan would have the better 4 players. I think there's a very real possibility that Michigan has multiple first-round picks along this defensive line playing significant snaps this year, and I think all 9 of the players that are rotating and playing a lot right now are draftable prospects at some point. There's a couple of them that are underclassmen. So if we're talking about depth and the ability to rotate, then I think Michigan is the pretty clear favorite in that. And I think it's fairly obvious, in my opinion, that that is the case. Michigan legitimately might have a top 3 defensive line in the entire country. I think you could also make the statement that Ohio State's starting 4 is like a top 5 to 10 unit in the country. But Michigan, as a defensive line unit that can rotate players, has a top 3 defensive line in the country. And when we're comparing defensive lines, they have the better defensive line. When it comes to the linebacker position, coming into this year, I wouldn't have thought that this would have been a conversation, but this is, in fact, a conversation. And that's mainly because Michael Barrett has gone from a guy who I thought had a decent chance to make an NFL roster as a priority undrafted free agent to a legitimate draftable prospect who has a role at the next level, which is more than just a potentially really, really good special teams player. So he's improved a whole lot, And Junior Colson, I think, has kind of met expectations for me. He's looked like a day 2 pick. And Ernest Hausman has had a role, although he's been pretty much just an athlete when he's been on the field. He looks like somebody who could be really good. Meanwhile, Ohio State, they've got Tommy Eichenberg, who, based on his play last year, was the best linebacker in the country. This year, he's kind of taken a step back. And I don't particularly know why. I haven't really done a deep dive into the film from 2022 and the film from this year to kind of figure out what was different. But I thought it was a mistake for him to come back, and his level of play this year has kind of proven me right. Now, Steele Chambers, the other starting linebacker who gets a lot of run, has elevated his game significantly this year. He's been absolutely phenomenal. And the other linebacker that Ohio State plays quite a bit is Cody Simon, and he's been really, really good too. So if we're looking at like a top 3 linebacker situation, because both teams do rotate those linebackers in, I think you can call Junior Colson and Tommy Eichenberg from this year a slight favor of Tommy Eichenberg. I think you can say Steele Chambers and Mike Barrett, you can say that that's a slight favorite for Michigan, because I do think Mike Barrett has elevated his game so much that he's actually the better football player right now. But when it comes to that third linebacker, I would say that Cody Simon is better than Ernest Hausman. And it has more to do with the fact that one group has had better play from the defensive linemen in front of them in terms of eating blocks and stuff, and the other group hasn't, and they're still very similar in terms of level of production. But when you were to actually sit down and watch the film of these players, it's pretty clear who has the better group of linebackers, and that's Ohio State. Because Ohio State does not have the same level of athlete or the same size that Michigan does, their linebackers are typically at more of a disadvantage in the run game than against Michigan. And I also just think flat out and straight up they're better in the pass game than Michigan as well. So overall, as a group, I'm going to give Ohio State the advantage at the linebacker position. Okay, so the last groups, the defensive backs here. This one is a really, really interesting conversation here because they're extraordinarily similar in my opinion. Effectively, there are 3 positions in the defensive back group: outside corner, slot corner, and safety. And now, if you want to talk about free safety and strong safety, or box safety and back safety, I think that you can go into the minutia of that if you want to, but for all intents and purposes, both safeties in both of these schemes have to be able to drop back and cover and have to be able to come up and tackle. So I don't particularly think there's much of a need to delineate between a strong safety and a free safety. So let's start with outside corners here, and let's talk about CB1 for both of these teams. CB1 for Michigan is Will Johnson, and CB1 for Ohio State is Denzel Burke. Now, I was not particularly a big believer in Denzel Burke in terms of actual play on the football field the past 2 years. I didn't get the first round hype. I thought, okay, yeah, maybe as an athlete, he's a first round sort of player, but he never actually backed it up on tape to me. This year is different. He's actually taken a massive step forward and been maybe the best corner in the Big Ten this year. And that's saying a lot because there's 3 or 4 first round corners in this draft class for the Big Ten. Will Johnson had a little bit of a slower start. He was dealing with some injuries, didn't really play in the warm-up games, and then came out and didn't particularly play all that well after that. He seemed to maybe finally get going a bit around the Minnesota game, and then like Purdue, it looked like he was finally back to end of his freshman year self. And then this past week against Maryland, he got beat a couple of times by a, granted, really good wide receiver in Prather, but he did still get beat quite a bit by a wide receiver that I think would be wide receiver 3 for Ohio State. And Denzel Burke just flat out and straight up hasn't gotten beat like that at any point this year. He's been absolutely incredible and is a legitimate first-round prospect in my opinion. I also think Will Johnson, in terms of like athleticism and also play from his freshman year, is also a first-round caliber corner. But so far this year, he hasn't particularly lived up to that hype, in my opinion. That's not saying that he's bad, okay, but he's not played at the same level that he played at last year. So when we're talking about CB1, I would give Ohio State the edge there. If we move on to CB2, because he played 2 outside corners, that's a little bit more of an interesting conversation because Ohio State has Noah Igbinosun and Michigan has Josh Wallace, 2 transfer cornerbacks. Now, Igbinosun was a true freshman last year. He's a true sophomore this year. And he's been okay. Like, he's honestly been really good in the run game and coming up and tackle people. But in coverage, he has gotten beat a bit more consistently than other corners in the country. And Josh Wallace hasn't particularly gotten beat like that this year. And he was Michigan's CB1 for about 4 weeks when Will Johnson was hurt. And he held it down like a CB1 would. So when we're talking about CB2, I would give the advantage to Michigan, which makes pretty much the whole corner group because neither of these teams rotate their outside corners particularly well, or at all, just to be honest with you. I think we can effectively say that the outside cornerback position is a wash. Ohio State slight advantage CB1, Michigan slight advantage CB2. So if we move on to the slot here, that's Jordan Hancock versus Mike Sanderstill. And Jordan Hancock has actually played really well this year for Ohio State. And to have a 6'1" corner who can move like that as your slot corner is an incredible advantage in college football. Because if another team were to move a bigger wide receiver into the slot, that's a mismatch for Michigan, but it isn't a mismatch for Ohio State. So having a bigger corner like that who can still guard the smaller, quicker guys, but then also have the size to deal with a big slot is an extraordinary advantage in the college football landscape. And that's one that Michigan doesn't have. That being said, Mike Sanderstill is the best slot corner in the country and maybe the best defensive player on the Michigan team. Now, he's not going to win the Jim Thorpe Award, but he should be in the conversation for it. And Jordan Hancock, even though he's a better NFL prospect than Mike Sanderstill, he is not a better player. So I am going to give the edge to Michigan in the slot. Now, the safety position is the last position here, and this is interesting because Michigan has rotated about 4 players in there that have gotten snaps during actual games. And Ohio State has rotated about 3 players in there. Now, Sonny Styles has pretty exclusively played the box/the slot position here. So he's a little bit less versatile than some of the other players we're going to talk about. Now, Michigan's starting safeties have been hurt a little bit so far this year. Rod Moore and Makari Page have both missed time. So we really got to see the depth from the Michigan secondary this year. And the single player that has impressed me the most has been Keon Saab. And Rod Moore and Makari Page have had a harder time than last year kind of getting going a little bit. And it's because they've both been hurt and Michigan has been rotating the safeties a bit more even when they've been healthy than they normally do because George Johnson and Keon Saab played really, really well. Here's the thing. If we were going off of play last year, this would be clear-cut in Michigan's favor for the safety position. But we're not going off of play from last year. And this year, Josh Proctor has played really, really well. And Latham Rantham has improved. And Sonny Styles is getting snaps and playing well. And Michigan's safeties are playing not at the same level as they were last year. So, funnily enough, I think Ohio State's safeties have raised their play enough, and Michigan safeties have lowered their play enough for this to effectively be a wash, which means that the only position I was able to make a definitive statement on being the slot corner position with Mike Sanderstill, meaning that I would say that Michigan does just slightly have a better group of defensive backs than Ohio State. Okay, so let's summarize the positional breakdown here. At the quarterback position, I gave Michigan the edge. At the running back position, I gave Ohio State the edge. At the skill positions, I gave Ohio State the edge. Along the offensive and defensive line, I gave Michigan the edges. At the linebacker position, I gave Ohio State a slight edge. And at the defensive back position, I gave Michigan a slight edge, meaning that I'm giving Michigan an overall edge in terms of the positional battles 4-3. And effectively, this is just who has more talent. That's basically what this is looking at here. And I think overall, I would say that this year, Michigan does have a bit more talent and is overall a better team if you were to take matchups out of the discussion. Now, you can't take matchups out of the discussion, and Ohio State matches up really well against Michigan. So let's go ahead and talk about that. Effectively, what these matchups are going to show is how the game is actually played. This is basically the micro. The positional breakdowns and comparing who's better, that's the macro. And this is the micro. So let's go here group by group here. Okay, so Michigan's quarterback versus Ohio State's defense as a whole, the whole unit. I'm giving Ohio State the advantage there. Michigan's offensive line versus Ohio State's front seven. I'm giving Ohio State the advantage there. Even though Michigan has a better offensive line than Ohio State, I'm still giving Ohio State the advantage along the front seven because they're so quick, and even though they are undersized, Michigan has struggled against undersized, quicker defensive linemen fairly consistently the past 3 years. And the linebacker play is good enough to overcome that lack of size along the interior defensive line. So I'm going to give the edge to Ohio State's defensive front seven when we're talking about that versus Michigan's offensive line and running backs. Basically the running game. I'm going to give Ohio State the advantage. Now, the Michigan skill position players and passing game versus the Ohio State linebackers and defensive backs. Who has the advantage there? It's the Ohio State linebackers and defensive backs, or the back seven, as I have called them here. The fact of the matter is that Michigan does not have a player who has a positive matchup against anybody in Ohio State secondary. Roman Wilson is good, okay? Denzel Burke's a first-round caliber corner. He's going to look at Roman Wilson and be like, I'm not scared of you at all. Mainly because Roman Wilson is like a late day 3 pick, in my opinion. And Denzel Burke, as I've stated multiple times now, is a first-round type of corner. So now let's talk about the OSU QB versus the Michigan defense as a whole, as a unit. And I'm going to give the advantage to Michigan on that. If Michigan can provide pressure, Kyle McCord has shown to get a little bit rattled at times when he gets hit. Now, he's barely gotten hit this year, but Ohio State has also not particularly played a defensive line that has the depth and the ability to just play at 100% effort for an entire game like this. So we don't particularly know if Ohio State's offensive line is going to be able to hold up in this game. And we'll talk about that in just a second. But I still think overall the Michigan defense does have an advantage against the Ohio State offense. So the Ohio State offensive line versus the Michigan front seven, I'm giving that edge to Michigan in both the run game and the passing game. Now, Ohio State has been maybe even elite at pass blocking this year, but a lot of that is smoke and mirrors, in my opinion. Pretty much whenever they're calling a 5-step drop sort of play or a play that takes a while to develop, they're keeping 1 or 2 people in extra to block. And Michigan's defensive line is good enough to, even if you're double teaming 2 players, to still be able to get pressure. Now, this is the last one here, okay? The Ohio State skill positions in passing game versus Michigan's defensive backs. Even though I said Michigan had the better group of defensive backs, just slightly, Ohio State skill position players, mainly because of Marvin Harrison, is on a different goddamn planet, okay? Marvin Harrison is an alien. There is not a corner in the history of college football that would be able to guard him one-on-one. And Ohio State, through 11 games, has mastered the ability to get Marvin Harrison one-on-ones. So even if you are double teaming Marvin Harrison, they're just going to throw the ball to Emeka Egbuka because there's not very many corners in football that can cover Emeka Egbuka one-on-one, especially out of the slot. And Emeka Egbuka has been hurt on and off throughout the year, but he appears to be healthy now. And even if that is coverage, then Kyle McCord can just check it down to Travion Henderson or Cade Stober and get 5 or 6 yards fairly easily. Overall, the Ohio State skill position players do have, in my opinion, a definitive advantage over the Michigan defensive backs and linebackers that are going to be covering them. So Ohio State actually matches up pretty good against Michigan. However, the single biggest mismatch on this board is the Michigan defensive line in front seven versus the Ohio State offensive line. So if Michigan's defensive line can take over the game, which they are very capable of doing, they have the talent. If they can take over the game, then Ohio State will not be able to be effective on offense, even though they do have the advantage when it comes to skill positions versus back seven. The last thing that needs to be talked about here is the narratives entering this game. This is an underrated aspect of football that I think some people overlook. And that's all of the superficial sort of stuff. The stuff that isn't actually about the game being played on the field, but rather everything else. The first thing I want to talk about here in the narrative section here is Kyle McCord on the road versus Kyle McCord at home. And the difference in numbers is fairly staggering. He has like a 7 or 8% drop off in completion percentage. When it comes to the most useful statistic that PFF has to offer, which is turnover worthy plays, meaning that plays that could have been a turnover even if they were dropped or whatever, so they are graded negatively. Kyle McCord has 13 of them so far this year. 8 have come on the road, 5 at home. And for the more traditional statistics, all 4 of Kyle McCord's interceptions have come on the road, and 3 of his 4 fumbles have come on the road. So it appears that Kyle McCord does have a little bit of a dichotomy between playing at home and playing on the road. And this game is in Ann Arbor. Now, the ultimate counterpoint to that is that Kyle McCord beat Notre Dame on the road and led a game-winning drive to do so. So I'm not sure if that narrative is entirely like a real thing, or if he's just happened to play better defenses more consistently on the road than at home. The weather is the next thing that we're going to talk about here, okay? Because I think the weather would actually be an advantage for Michigan in this game, even though Ohio State has gotten much better at being physical and not so reliant on the pass game as they have been in years past. It is likely going to be cold, and there is a chance of snow this Saturday. However, when it is cold, it is a little bit harder to catch the football. And when it is snowing, it's a little bit harder to get your feet in the run game. So, hypothetically, if it is snowing and it is cold, then Michigan would have a little bit of an advantage because we've effectively seen them turn into a team from the 1920s before already and win a football game doing that. Next one is a little bit of a quick one, but this is probably going to be the most tense or one of the most tense ever renditions of the game. So whichever team can keep a cool head is likely going to have an advantage. The next one is desperation. Now, I picked Ohio State entering this year to win this game, mainly because I said Ryan Day with a loss already in the year, which is what I predicted. I predicted he would lose to Wisconsin, but that didn't happen because Tanner Mordecai got hurt. Nevertheless, I thought Ohio State would be the more desperate team. I thought they would be the team with their back against the wall, and Michigan would be the team maybe looking down on them. That is not the case anymore. If Michigan loses this game, everything they have done in the past 2 years is completely invalidated. No one of sound, rational mind will consider their 2 Big Ten championships and their 2 wins over Ohio State to be legitimate, and that includes myself. So Michigan, in some ways, is carrying the pride of their entire program and everything they've done the past 2 years and this year into this game and saying everything is dependent upon this. They are the more desperate football team, and that can be a good thing if you can keep your head, or it can be a tremendously bad thing if you can't keep your head. And Jim Harbaugh is not there to keep this team level. So I would consider that in Ohio State's favor. Now, the next thing is convincingly not in the favor of Ohio State. The line for this game opened at, I believe, either 6 or 6.5. After about 20 minutes, it was down to 4 because 85% of the money came in on Ohio State. And if you know how lines work, you know that Vegas does not put lines out there where 85% of people are going to be correct. And they've done this several times this year even, because Vegas is very good at what they do, and that's making money by convincing people they're making a good bet when in reality they are not. If I was an Ohio State fan, that would be the single most terrifying thing I've ever heard of in my entire life, because Vegas is not in the business of giving out a payday to 85% of people who make a bet on something. Now, it can happen. It's happened before, but it doesn't happen most of the time. In fact, the vast majority of the time, when all of the money comes in on one team, the other team wins, or at least covers. The last thing I want to talk about here is big players in big games. And the fact of the matter is that Michigan is far more experienced than Ohio State when it comes to big plays and big games, okay? And the fact of the matter is that Ohio State, when the lights are on the brightest this year, has kind of struggled a bit more than when they weren't. And Michigan, the only time they've had the spotlight on them, their best players played really, really well, and that was Blake Corum and Donovan Edwards. Also, J.J. McCarthy went 7 for 8. He was doing okay until they decided to completely abandon the pass game. That being said, when Kyle McCord and these Ohio State teams have needed to step up, they've stepped up every single time. However, you and I both know Michigan versus Ohio State is different. The lights are brighter, the pressure is greater, and the stakes are higher. And I know for a fact that the players Michigan has on their roster are capable of delivering amongst all of those factors. I don't know if Ohio State's players are. All of this has been leading to this, my prediction. Who do I think will win in the game? I got no fucking clue. Now, don't fret. I am going to give you an actual legitimate prediction, but I have no idea who's going to win this game. Like, zero ideas, okay? I've gone through this from just about every angle that I can think of, and these teams are so ridiculously evenly matched, it's absolutely absurd. So I pretty much just have to go with my gut here and say who I think wins the game based off of basically absolutely nothing. I don't see a definitive game-changing advantage for either team. I think there are potential for certain matchups to be game-breaking and the reason that a team wins, but I'm not extraordinarily confident that any of them are actually going to come to fruition. Chances are one of them will, but I don't know which one. And I'm pretty much just going to go with my gut here. And I'm going to stick with my preseason prediction. And basically, this is how I see the game coming out. Ohio State is not going to be able to consistently move the ball. However, they're going to get several long, big touchdowns from Travion Henderson and Marvin Harrison. Michigan is at an extraordinarily disadvantage on the offensive side of the ball. However, they're going to be able to put some drives together, get a field goal maybe one time, score a couple of touchdowns. But when it comes down to it, Ohio State's going to do what they've done in pretty much every game this year that's been remotely close, and that's pull away in the fourth quarter with a long touchdown drive. But that's just me. And what do I know? I'm just some asshole on the internet giving you his opinion. It's at this time I'd like to remind you to like the video if you liked it, subscribe if you want to see more content like this, and if you disagree with me at any point, or you just have something to say, go ahead and drop a comment down in the comment section below. It's been real, so I'll see you next time.